I didn't marry a bad man. He's kind in the way a reliable clock is kind, always ticking, always present, but never really noticing you. When he leaves for work each morning, he kisses the top of my head like a habit, not like a man who wakes to be near his wife. And then the house empties out, except for me. Silence becomes the loudest thing I hear. We live far from the city, tucked away, where the fields stretch like thoughts left unfinished. It's peaceful, sure, but peace without company feels like punishment. At first, I'd spend the days cleaning, baking, folding, waiting. Hours would pass and I'd think he'll call. But he rarely did. I stopped expecting it. That's when I started going to the stables more. The black horse was different from the others, taller, stronger, more watchful. He looked at me in a way I hadn't been looked at in years. Not with lust, of course, but with presence. Like I was there, real, visible. I started brushing his coat every morning, running my hands over the muscles that twitched and shifted under my touch. The horse didn't speak, but in his stillness, I heard a kind of listening. My husband used to ask me how my day was. Lately, he didn't even ask. And I stopped answering questions no one was asking. I began talking to the horse. About small things at first, weather, breakfast, memories of my childhood. Then about my fears, my regrets. The things I could never say aloud in the house because they'd only echo back at me. Every day, I stayed longer in the stable. I took comfort in the rhythm of feeding him, in the quiet understanding between us. I knew it was irrational. He was just a horse. But it was because he couldn't speak that I could finally say everything. And he never left. My husband used to have that kind of patience. Or maybe I only imagined he did. Maybe I've always been more in love with the idea of being seen than with the man himself. Either way, I couldn't ignore what I was feeling anymore. I began to crave the time I spent out there. My day started to revolve around those stolen hours, not around chores, not around marriage. I didn't plan it. I wasn't looking for a distraction. But I missed being wanted,
Missed being listened to.
and somehow, this silent creature gave me more emotional safety than my own husband. Was I overthinking?
Projecting? Possibly.
But I also knew this wasn't just some passing attachment. It was something deeper. Something forming in the hollow space where love used to be. And if my husband ever noticed how much time I spent in the stables, he never said a word. Maybe that was the saddest part of all. It started with small things. I began waking up early before the sun, just to be near him. I would slip on boots over bare feet, still in my nightgown, and walk straight to the stables. The air would be cold, my breath visible, but I didn't feel it. All I could think about was him. How his eyes followed me, how he stood completely still when I came close, how he leaned into my touch like he needed it too. I talked more. Told him stories I hadn't even told my husband. Not because I was hiding, but because my husband wouldn't understand. Or maybe he wouldn't care. There's a difference. With the horse, it wasn't about words or answers. It was about presence. When I spoke, he stayed. He never filled the silence with fixes or logic. He just existed with me. I stopped waiting for my husband's messages. Stopped checking his location on my phone. What would be the point? I knew where he was, some clinic, some farm call, some emergency. Always useful, never emotional. I stopped cooking full meals. I forgot laundry in the washer. All I could think about was getting back out there. Not to do anything, just to be close. I began noticing things I shouldn't have. How I held my breath when I touched the horse's neck. How my chest ached when I left the stables. I told myself it was comfort, not desire. But I was lying. I began dreaming of escape, running through the open fields, bareback, wind on my face, no one expecting anything of me. In those dreams, I wasn't a wife. I was a woman. Once, I found myself imagining what it would be like if the horse were a man. Not in the physical sense, but in essence. Loyal.
Silent. Strong.
Understanding. I hated myself for thinking it, but I didn't stop. The nights changed. I'd lie next to my husband, wide awake, and feel nothing when his arm brushed mine. I used to crave his warmth. Now it felt foreign, like being touched by someone I hadn't chosen. I tried to fight it. I prayed. I journaled. I stayed away from the stable for 3 days. It was unbearable. My chest felt tight. I cried when I fed the chickens. The silence in the house began to press down on me like a weight. When I finally went back, the horse stepped toward me instantly, like he'd been waiting too. I broke down. I buried my face in his neck and cried without holding back. It was the first time I'd felt safe enough to collapse. I didn't speak about love. I didn't need to. I knew what this was. Not a fantasy. Not a phase. It was connection. Raw and unfiltered. The kind I hadn't felt in years. The kind I had once promised to have forever, but lost in the rhythm of bills and routine and unspoken disappointments. What scared me wasn't that I loved the horse. It was that I didn't love my husband anymore. And I couldn't remember when that changed. He came home 2 days earlier than planned. I was in the stable, brushing the horse like always, whispering to him like he was the only one who understood me. I didn't hear my husband walk up. I just felt his presence, stiff, confused, hurt. I turned slowly. His eyes weren't angry, just searching. And I had no defense to offer. He didn't speak right away. Just stared at me, at the way I was touching the horse. Finally, he asked, "What's going on with you?" I wanted to lie. Say I was just lonely, just tired. But something in his face made it impossible. I stayed quiet, and silence did the speaking. That night, we barely said a word to each other. At dinner, he asked, "Is there someone else?" I dropped my fork. I couldn't look at him. "No," I said. But the pause before that word said everything. He didn't press, but his expression changed. He looked like someone realizing they were already too late. The next day, he waited for me to come inside. I didn't. He found me again in the stable. He stood outside and said, "Tell me the truth. Do you love that horse more than me?" It sounded absurd. I almost laughed. But I didn't. I looked at him and said, "No. But he listens to me. You don't." The words landed like a slap. He stepped back like I'd physically hit him. "You're comparing me to an animal?" he asked, voice low, sharp. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The pain was already between us, thick and choking. He turned and walked away without another word. I didn't follow. Later that night, he packed a bag. Not all of his things. Just enough to leave for a while. I watched from the hallway. He didn't look at me once. When the door shut behind him, I didn't cry. I just stood there, empty, like a vase turned upside down. I slept in our bed alone for the first time in years. But it didn't feel new. It felt familiar. As if I'd already been sleeping alone for a long time, even when he was beside me. The next morning, I returned to the stable. The horse was waiting. He came to me like always. I leaned into him, not to hide, but to feel something steady. Something unchanging. I thought about everything I'd said, everything I hadn't. I hadn't kissed another man. I hadn't crossed any line with my body. But emotionally, I had already left my marriage long ago. I wondered if he'd ever come back. My husband, I mean. And if he did, would anything change? Could anything? I didn't have answers. All I knew was this. I didn't feel guilt. I felt grief. Not over what I'd done, but over what had already died between us. Sometimes, you don't cheat with a person. You cheat with the version of yourself that remembers how it felt to be wanted. That's the version I had become again. And I didn't want to give her up. He didn't come back for 3 days. The house was quiet, heavier than usual, but I didn't fill it with anything. No calls. No explanations. I went about the routines, but they felt empty, automatic. I kept away from the stable, not because I wanted to, but because I needed space to think. What started as comfort had become a confession I couldn't take back. And now, I was left alone with what I'd broken. On the 4th day, I found a note in the kitchen. He'd stopped by while I was asleep. It was short. "I read your journal. I understand now. I'm not sure what to say." No anger. No accusation. Just the truth. He had finally read the things I'd never dared say aloud. Pages of loneliness. Memories of who we used to be. Pain I had wrapped in silence for too long. I didn't know how much of it hurt him, or if it helped. But I knew he had finally seen me. Later that evening, he returned. We sat at opposite ends of the living room. I offered him tea. He declined. We didn't rush the words. Eventually, he asked, "Was it really about the horse?" I shook my head.
No.
It was about the emptiness, the silence between us. I just found something that made me feel alive again. That made me feel heard. He stared at the floor. "I didn't know you felt that alone." I nodded. "You stopped seeing me. I didn't stop loving you right away. It just faded." We didn't cry. There were no raised voices. Just truth, finally laid bare between us. He said, "So, what now?" I didn't have an answer. Neither did he. I told him I wasn't in love with anyone else. But I wasn't in love with him either. I said, "I want to be honest from here on out, whatever that means. No pretending." He nodded. Maybe that was all we could do now, acknowledge what was broken without forcing it to look fixed. The next morning, I went to the stable again. The horse was there, waiting like always. But something was different. I touched him gently, whispered my goodbye. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood what he had given me, space to feel again. And now I had to step out of that space and face whatever came next. When I walked back to the house, my husband was outside. We didn't speak. He just looked at me with something softer than before, not love, but recognition. Like he was finally seeing the woman he'd stopped looking for. We're still figuring things out. No dramatic changes. No declarations. Just quieter mornings, occasional questions, fewer assumptions. It's fragile, but it's real. I don't regret what happened. It woke me up. It forced me to feel, to confront the parts of myself I'd buried under routine and silence. And if that makes me unfaithful, then maybe so is every person who stops listening, who walks past their partner without looking. Love doesn't always end in betrayal. Sometimes it ends in a mirror. And for the first time, I'm not afraid to look.